Welcome to the Great Loop Radio podcast, brought to you by America's Great Loop Cruisers Association. We're dedicated to providing Great Loop information and inspiration with those actively cruising, planning for, or dreaming about a Great Loop adventure. I'm Kim Russo. I'm the director of AGLCA. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more, primarily focusing on some things that loopers should know before they really get ready to hit the water on their Great Loop. My guest today will be Boris Hodak. He is a recent Gold Looper and also a 100-ton master captain. So lots of experience, and he's going to share some of that with you today. Before we jump into the conversation, as always, I want to take a moment to recognize and thank our Admiral sponsors who support AGLCA at the highest level. They are Curtis Stokes & Associates, Great Loop Yacht Sales, Passage Maker Trawler Fest, Skipper Bob Publications, and Waterway Guide Media. As always, we encourage our listeners and viewers to support these businesses that support the Great Loop. And now let's move right into our conversation. Boris, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure meeting you before. And congrats on you finishing your loop, by the way.
Well, thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks.
So,
Congratulations to you, too. And yeah, we met along the way in Columbus, Mississippi, I believe was the place.
That's correct.
Went to a dinner with a whole group of loopers, and it was a pleasure to have two families there, one being yours and another family, because that's not something we get to do every day. So the kids all got to meet each other. But let's start off. Tell us a little bit about your boating experience, because it's extensive and it's not necessarily until the Great Loop on the East Coast. So that's a little bit different than a lot of our loopers.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Croatia, and so in a sea town, and so boated all the time, fishing, Adriatic and Mediterranean Sea when I was younger. And so when I came to the U.S., I was got located in Seattle, which is in Puget Sound, and absolutely gorgeous waters. And it's difficult not to be in Puget Sound and not to boat, because there's just so many beautiful things to see. And continue to boat over there, and have been doing it since I was, moved to Seattle almost 30 years ago now. And so my experience has been, getting bigger and bigger boats and getting more and more experience. And one day I have two other friends that we went through the chairs for our yacht clubs. My wife is a previous Commodore for her yacht club. So we met them through that, and those two guys said, "Hey, let's go get captain's licenses," and we did. and then,
Mm-hmm.
and that was a really truly eye-opening experience. And so since then we've been doing a lot of fun boating stuff, and boating in Puget Sound has been interesting. It's taught me a lot of different things, but just experience in Mediterranean, Adriatic Sea, the Puget Sound, I've been exposed to quite a few different things.
Yeah, well, and now the entire Great Loop. So tell us, as
Yes.
I already mentioned, you did the Great Loop with your wife and children. So tell us why your family decided now is the time for your Great Loop, especially coming from the West Coast and traveling that far to do the Great Loop.
So the stars kind of aligned. We one of the friends that has asked us to do the Grey Loop is actually the same friend that suggested we get captain's licenses. And so we've been talking about this Grey Loop for a very long time, or he has been. And we never thought that we could really do it, because kids are in school, and a lot of things were going on. And financially, it's a very big responsibility to do the loop, especially with a family like ours. And so we really didn't think it would happen. And then the pandemic came around, and we started homeschooling, and we were introduced to that. And then we had our 43-foot boat in Seattle, Bayliner 4388, that we spent the pandemic on. And so we'd be on the boat for 3, 4, 5 weeks at a time, boating around, and we realized, hey, this is actually not that bad. A lot of our assumptions were based on, oh, it's too small, oh, we can't do this. No, what I think we just needed to do is just shift our view of it a little bit, and then we can make it work. And financially, we thought, hey, we can figure out finances, because I've been working off the boat, and my wife took the time off to teach the kids. So we figured out we can do it.
Yeah. And we should probably mention your kids are, I think they're both teenagers, if I'm not mistaken, correct? So we're not
That's
talking about very young children.
no, my daughter is 13, my son is 11.
Hmm.
And so this was the other reason why I really thought that it's now or never type of a deal is because right at this time, our daughter is getting into junior high, our son is in the elementary school. Anytime if we wait any longer, they're going to have these friendships that we're going to jerk them away from in the future, high school and everything else. And it just would not really fit. So we thought this is the right time. Like anything older than that would be a little bit difficult. And we've run across quite a few people on the loop that have kids that are younger than ours. We've run into some that have kids they're a little bit older, but not that many. And we realized that this was about the right choice for their
Yeah.
age.
Perfect. Well, we mentioned that you're a 100-ton master, which is a
Yes.
pretty extensive license. Lots of experience goes along with that credential. So congratulations to you. And of course, that makes you more experienced immediately at the start
Yeah.
of your loop than many of our members. Um, so you and I got to talking, and you suggested that there were probably some things that loopers really need to know a little bit more about before
Mhm.
they start the Great Loop. And one of the things, we kind of preach here at AGLCA is doing it safely and in a way that is meaningful to you. But you're always going to have a better time if you're being safe out there. And we've done a
Exactly.
lot of episodes lately. We did one a couple weeks ago on watching your wake, and we did one, I think, just last week on looping on a faster boat, which also kind of goes along with safety and courtesy as you're on the waterway. But we kind of want to extend that discussion a little bit today with
Mhm.
Boris. And let's talk a little bit about one of the places that a lot of people don't have experience until the loop, and that is locking. So from your
Yes.
experience out there with other loopers, what do you wish more loopers knew about locking before they actually got there on the loop?
So for us in Puget Sound, we were fortunate enough that we have locks between Lake Washington and Puget. And so going in and out is somewhat, familiar to us. But so we had a little bit of practice, right?
Hmm.
But I understand that a lot of people might not have that opportunity. The first thing, and I know you guys have said this many times, is don't just buy a boat and do the loop immediately after, right?
Hmm.
Bad idea. You need to familiarize yourself with a boat. If you've done dual engine boating, and you decide to get a single engine trawler, it's going to behave differently. Going in, prop walk and all the other stuff that you need to learn about and get comfortable with while docking. It's going into a lock is not much different than going into a slip. In certain ways, it's very um, very similar, and in some cases, it's easier because you have a little bit more space to maneuver. The main thing to consider is that when you're going into a slip, a lot of times you're going to have somebody catch your line, somebody help you out. In many locks, they don't have that. You have to go and grab the line that's provided to you by the locks, especially if the locks are going up. You have to grab the line that's provided to you, or you have to hold on to a bollard and tie off to a bollard. So you have to make sure that you are prepared, that you have the lines on the right, correct side, calling the lock in advance via radio, or calling the lock in advance via phone. A lot of locks have phones, and talking to the lockmaster if it's your first time, saying, "Hey, it's my first time. I'm really sorry. I want to prepare myself for this. I don't want to be one of those people that doesn't know what they're doing. So could you please help me out?" And they have actually been absolutely amazing with a lot of our because we have traveled on this boat on this journey with 3 or 4 boats, and so I will or so one of our compadres will call in and say, "Hey, we have 4 boats coming in. How do you want us to proceed? When time would you like us to come in?" Um, and we had this conversation, and the lockmaster will actually guide us and tell us, "Okay, I want you here at 7:30 in the morning. Make sure that you have your lines ready for port side, or make sure that you have a port side tie or starboard side tie." We asked them, "Do you want us to raft or not?" So we cover a few things. In some locks, they don't want you rafting because the currents in the middle are very strong. and they move the boats around quite a bit. So unless you know how to raft really well, they really don't like that. In other locks, they really don't care. And some locks, they tell you, no, I want you to raft two boats all the way in the front, large vessel on the wall, smaller vessel on the side. So they have certain rules. Generally, the reason why you want the larger boat on the lock wall is just the sheer size of the vessel, and that a lot of times the currents will come from the center up the walls of the lock, and so you want that larger vessel to be closer to the wall so it doesn't impact the vessel moving back and forth. And so there's a lot of things that you can do with locking. If you've never done a lock and you want to practice, like I said, it's very similar to going into a slip or a wall, not necessarily a slip, but going on a dock wall. So find an empty dock wall where there's not much traffic, where there's not much, other boats around, where you're not going to interfere with regular traffic, and practice. Take your boat, go in and see, wind is coming from this way. This is how my boat behaves. The current is going this way. There's going to be some current in the locks because there is moving water going in. So this is how my boat behaves in different situations. So you can get yourself a little bit more comfortable with how your boat responds to different situations.
Yeah. And so much great information in there, Boris. So thank you for that. Probably the best tip, as you said, is just to gather the information by contacting the lock and then being prepared, particularly if you're traveling in a large group. And I know you had 3 or 4 boats, but at certain points this past season, because of lock closures and then the reopening, there were loopers moving in groups of, 16 or more boats, which requires rafting in the locks.
Yes.
And locking is one of the places where it becomes routine and easy. But if something doesn't go well, it is probably one of the more potentially dangerous points in your looping experience. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to cover them today. Because in addition to some things can sometimes go wrong, there are sometimes that a boat makes a mistake or doesn't know the procedure. We always call the lock. I love to know which side we will be tying to, because for me, handling the lines, that just gives me a peace of mind to know what's coming up. I like to know also what kind of tie-off it is, because you handle it slightly differently, not hugely differently. I mean, there's a decent difference between a bollard, which if you're not familiar with that, you're kind of tossing your line around almost a can in the lock and bringing it back to the boat. And that's different than if you're bringing your line around a cable or a rope that's hanging down. Not a much different procedure, but just a little bit different. So find out all those facts. And if they're not available to you online, call the lockmaster on the radio or the phone number, as Boris suggested. And it just helps it be more orderly, especially if it's a large group of boats traveling together. And also arrival time. So Boris, you touched on all those things, and that is great. Walk us through, though, a little bit, from start to finish, though, if you are going into a lock.
Sure.
Let's assume you already know which side you're going to. But we've seen some dangerous maneuvers in locks.
Very true.
So kind of tell us the right way to lock through.
Yeah. So the number one thing that generally you're going to be locking through with several other boats. There's been a handful of times where we've been a lone boat or maybe a couple of different boats. So generally it's going to be a larger group. So it's good before going through the locks to get on the radio, 68, 69 channel, whatever it is, talk to the group and make sure that you coordinate between all the different boats around. Like I said, the locks want large boats on the wall. I have not gone through a single lock, and we've gone well over 100 locks on this trip alone. That they don't want large boats on the wall first. So it's larger boats on the walls, smaller boats on the inside. So by communicating through with the rest of the group and figuring out who's the bigger boat, then you know which boats need to go first in. So there's no confusion. And I've seen people go, oh, the lock master said go first, and so it's like a 35-footer going in there when we have a 60-footer behind him, and the lock master will say, hey, sorry, you need to go back, and it causes issues. So coordinate that. Obviously get on the horn with the lockmaster. It's good to have a single person that communicates with the lockmaster, so they don't have to go back and forth a lot of times. And so that person will communicate with the lockmaster and say, "Hey, we're ready for lockage." The lockmaster turns the light green, and then the large boats start coming in. The lockmaster will coordinate between the large boats where they want them. A lot of times they'll want somewhat smaller boats in the front, the larger boats in the middle, and then somewhat smaller boats in the back. And then once that row of boats is in, then the next step comes in. Most of the time, the lockmaster will walk you through, hey, there's a current here. We want you to go a little bit more to the starboard or a little bit more to the port. And you just kind of guide your boat in. They're really good at communicating. One thing that I would say is if the boat does something that you are not familiar with, or it does something unexpected, I know this sounds really easy to say and hard to do, but don't panic. It's an important thing. Stay calm. Small adjustments, not large. I have seen people get on the throttle, put it in reverse, do something really major, and the boat will do something very major. When you make small adjustments, then small things happen. And even if you bump, it's going to be a small hit, a small rub, versus something that is going to require a lot of repair later on. And so stay calm, don't panic, get in the first couple of times, obviously you're going to be really, really nervous about it. Put a lot of fenders out there. Generally, when you go into the locks, the boat on the wall puts most of their fenders on the wall side to protect their boat, and then incoming boat uses their fenders to protect themselves and the boat on the wall, right? So I've had people that have a lot of fenders, put them on both sides, but generally the incoming boat will have the fenders on their incoming side. Never ever tie off your line on the cleat. Usually a simple figure eight and then hold the line, but never lock it off because you will cut your line. And I've made that mistake in the Erie Canal once. It's not that I forgot, I just got complacent and I did something that I shouldn't have. Ended up cutting my line. So it happens, right? And then once you're there, just make sure that you hold your lines right, and that when you're going up, there's going to be a lot of current. Your boat is going to dance a little bit. Generally, I don't like using engines to move the boats around. I like to use the fenders. I like to use things that are kind of designed to move the boats around and pull on the lines, just to make sure that everybody stays where they're supposed to. And from there on out, once you go up or once you go down, go in slow, orderly fashion and move the boats along the way.
Yeah, one, and that's all great. And I want to come back to several of those things, but thank you for mentioning not to actually cleat off the line, because we do talk about tying off in the lock, and you really are not truly tying off. You are securing yourself to the lock wall by the apparatus with the fenders. But yes, if you actually lock down the line, something can go wrong and your boat can end up hanging by the line or being pulled down by the line. And always have a knife nearby is another great tip. One of the more dangerous things we saw happening in a lock, because you just mentioned exiting slowly and orderly, was a delivery captain, actually, who was kind of in the center of the lock. There were probably 5 bollards and he was in the middle. Generally, and from your experience, tell me if this is an accurate statement, but generally you leave the lock in the order you entered. Exception being if you're rafted off, obviously the people who are rafted are going to have to leave first. But if everybody's against the wall, you typically leave the lock in the same order you came in. It's just orderly. It's just easier. And this delivery captain came flying from the middle of the lock to go around the other boats the second the door started to open. And nobody was looking for him because nobody expected that. So very important to leave orderly and more or less the same order you came in. Obviously, the boats towards the door that is opening should be the first ones to leave. And I'm glad you mentioned about the fender arrangement when rafting up, because a lot of people think if, okay, my fenders are against the lock wall and now somebody's rafting to me and I need another whole set of fenders. If it makes you more comfortable, sure, fine, go ahead and do that. But typically the boat rafting to you is going to supply the fenders in that case. The other thing, and I want to check this with your experience, because the other thing I kind of learned along the way is that it's a good idea for the boat that is rafting to the other boat to run the line to the other boat and then back to them. So when it's
Always.
time to let go, they can release them, or if something goes wrong, they can release themselves. They're not relying on the boat to which they are rafted to release the lines. And that you would agree with that.
Yeah, always. In all honesty, that general practice for me as a captain is your line should always tie off on your boat.
Mm-hmm.
Because then if I have to single-handedly captain my vessel, if something happens to my crew or I have to move the boat on my own, I can undo the lines off of the boat, never leaving my vessel. I can run up to the helm or, and then move my vessel without having to step off of it. So safety, generally the best rule is always clear it off on your boat if you can.
Yeah.
Uh,
The other
yeah.
thing I learned along the way, kind of boated for 20 or more years before starting the loop, but not in an area with locks. So one of the first locks we went through had the weighted lines. So Boris knows what I mean, but if you're listening or watching and you don't, there's a rope hanging from the top of the lock. There's a weight on the bottom that kind of keeps it, from swinging wildly. But the first time I went through one of those locks, I was holding literally with my hands the line. And the lockmaster kind of said, that'll be a lot easier on you if you let the cleat do the work for you and just tuck it under the horn on the cleat. Game changer. And I saw
Yes.
so many other inexperienced people locking. Our first kind of major repeated locks were the Erie Canal. And I saw so many people making the same mistake I made. And it's just, the cleat, it gives you that leverage. And I'm not a physics person, but it allows you you're trying to use brute strength to hold the boat near the wall when you're just holding that line is really tough. Looping it
So
under the horn or the cleat makes it a lot easier.
yeah, and another tip for people going through the locks is if the lock is very tall, what you want to do is actually take the rope and go to the further away cleat on the
Mm-hmm.
stern, right? And that way you have a lot more leverage to keep the boat in. As I mentioned, there's a lot of water that comes up the lock walls and they move the boat out of the way. So if you have that rope on the further away cleat on the stern, the bow will stay where it's at because it curves. That allows you to have a little bit more leverage and keep the boat against the wall.
Yeah, great tip. Let's go ahead and take a break and play a message from sponsors. When we come back, we've already been at it for a good amount of time. We try to keep these to roughly 30 minutes, but we've covered a lot of good ground. So when we come back, we'll jump into anchoring, which is something that's a little bit easier for folks to practice because you can do that in most places, regardless of where you're boating. So let's take that break and we'll be back in a moment. Life is better by the bay. Here in Panama City, Florida, we have deep blue water surrounded by arts and culture. We love our historic neighborhoods, southern coastal cuisine, and the songs and stories of our locals, and we're sure you will too. If you're traveling along America's Great Loop, drop your anchor at St. Andrews Bay in Panama City and enjoy easy access to waterfront restaurants and shopping, a favorite among loopers. Land or water, you're going to love it here. Visit destinationpanamacity.com and learn more. St. Mary's Intracoastal Gateway Marina is located in the heart of historic downtown St. Mary's, Georgia. It's a laid-back vibe with southern charm, perfect for relaxation or an adventure. We're easily accessible from the ICW. The marina offers 30 and 50 amp electric service, water, and at-your-slip pump-out, all included in the daily rate of $270 per foot. There's a nearby boaters lounge with TV and Wi-Fi, 2 bathrooms with showers, and free laundry open 24 hours. You'll also find a secure mailroom, loaner bikes, and dock carts for your use. Check us out at visitstmarys.com/marina. We're back on the Great Loop Radio podcast. My guest today is Boris Hodak. He is a recent Gold Looper with a lot of experience and based on his 100-ton master credential and what he saw on the loop, he had some suggestions for us on where loopers can focus a little bit of that training and practice before they start the loop to make things run more smoothly and more safe when you actually do get out there. So let's jump into anchoring, because that's another skill that even long-term boaters may not have done a whole lot of. If you're just kind of, out for a Saturday afternoon, you're probably not anchoring a tremendous amount, especially not the kind of anchoring where you want to make sure that that anchor holds overnight. When nobody is paying direct attention to it constantly, because hopefully you're getting a little bit of sleep while you're on the hook, hopefully.
Hopefully.
So yeah, tell us a little bit about, what are the best resources and the best ways to really figure out what works for you and your boat when you're at anchor?
So there's several things that I like to do right off the bat, regardless, and that is number one, verify the size of the anchor is appropriate for the boat. And if you go to the manufacturer's website, they will have guidelines. This is the holding strength of the anchor, approximate size, so you can get your vessel's gross weight and the size, and kind of understand, okay, this anchor is appropriate. A lot of times, what I've seen is that previous owners will actually put a smaller anchor on there for whatever reason,
Right.
and then it doesn't hold right. The second thing that I do is I automatically add chain onto it. Most East Coast boats come with 25 foot of chain and then a line afterwards. And the line works really good in shallow waters and calm waters, and for day use. But if you want to have a good night's sleep, generally I like to have anywhere between 200 and 300 feet of chain on the boat.
Mm-hmm.
Chain acts as a really good dampener for the vessel because of the weight. So when you put an anchor out and put 5-to-1 or 7-to-1 or 10-to-1 scope, depending on weather and waves and everything else, it will hold most of the time, unless the anchor was not set properly. And even then, because of the weight of the chain, because of the scope ratio, the chain will hold the vessel in place instead of just the anchor, which is the intended purpose.
Yeah.
So those are the two things. And then if you are doing your anchoring, the procedure that we do on a regular basis is we'll find a good spot in the Bahamas, Florida, most southern areas. You'll have clear enough view of the water down below, or you'll know how deep it is and where it's at. And we find a really good area. One thing that I found surprising, and it took me a little bit of to getting used to, is that on the East Coast it's very shallow.
Yes.
Puget Sound, I'm used to anchoring at, like, I look at 30 foot and go, well, that's a little bit shallow for me. But 50, 60 feet of water is where we generally anchor. Here, if I see 10, 15 foot, score, touchdown, we're good.
Right. Absolutely.
And so we will find a good appropriate spot. We will drop our anchor. We will put out about 2.5, maybe 3-to-1 scope on the chain for the anchor, and then we'll set the anchor by reversing the boat and usually going about a knot or so in reverse to get that anchor to set. You'll feel it, kind of pull you boat pull you back. You'll feel it set. The chain will tighten up, and then once we feel like the anchor is set, it hasn't slipped, the chain has held, and it hasn't gotten loose really quick, which is an indicator that the anchor has skipped. What we do is we put out our normal scope. One thing to keep in mind is that the scope should be whatever you decide, 3, 5, 7, or 10-to-1. It's not the depth of the water; it is the height from your pulpit all the way to the bottom. So whatever the depth of water, you need to add that pulpit height, and a lot of people don't realize that. So they'll do, oh, I did 5-to-1. They've anchored in 10 foot of water, and their 5-to-1 is 50 feet. Well, now they're actually 3-to-1 scope, and if the waves get higher, it all of a sudden you run into a risk of pulling that anchor out and not having a safe anchorage.
Yeah, and I think that is something a lot of people overlook. And if your pulpit's 5 feet, it doesn't sound like that much, but when you go a 7-to-1 scope, now you're 35 feet short on your line.
Yes.
So yeah, I think you're spot on that is one of the mistakes people sometimes make with anchoring. Anchoring is really a lot of science and part art as well.
It is.
Um, and there's lots of resources, there's lots of videos out there, there are books out there. So it really is something I think each person kind of needs to get comfortable with on their own. I get asked a lot, what kind of anchor, not size or anything like that, but what kind of anchor should you have for the Great Loop? And I think that also differs depending on your
It
boat.
does.
But do you have any recommendations on some that might be appropriate for the Great Loop?
I had great success with a Mantis.
Mm-hmm.
If you guys have seen the Rockna anchors, the
Mm-hmm.
ones or the Vulcan, um, the Mantis company is actually the ones that invented both styles,
Mm-hmm.
and they are the only ones that are certified by Lloyd's of London as super holding anchor for vessels.
Mm-hmm.
And I love them. They're made in Australia. They're actually quite more affordable than most of the other ones, and they really do well. We had an 80-pound Mantis on the front of our boat, and we had 4 boats rafted on a single anchor. Had a great night of sleep. It sets really well. It comes out really clean. I've been absolutely impressed, and everybody that I know has been really impressed
Yeah.
with them.
A couple of courtesy type questions for
Yes.
anchoring. So I get asked a lot also, and this happens, sometimes coming down the river system, particularly if there are a lot of boats, some of the anchorages get a little bit more crowded. What
Yes.
is the etiquette on coming into an anchorage if there are already boats there? How far away should you stay? And you've got to consider the scope and that people may swing some on the anchor. So what are your thoughts on, if you're approaching an anchorage that's already pretty crowded, do you need to find somewhere else, or how do you determine whether it's okay to go ahead and drop anchor?
So this is a trick that I wish I had come up with myself, but somebody else taught me that a while ago. Get a golf measuring device, the scopes,
Mm-hmm.
um, because they'll tell you the yardage between you and the other, and that will help you determine how much swing room you have, because it is going to be a circle from the spot, and so you can see generally, the more you anchor, the more you get accustomed to this is how much my boat needs. And you start thinking about, can I fit in these areas? Don't come in and set an anchor right in front of somebody. If you're setting an anchor, the best way that I can suggest is if you drop your anchor at the bow of the other vessel or parallel to the bow of the other vessel. You will never drop an anchor, your anchor in front of them or on top of them. You'll never drag over their chain. And that allows you to then go back down and establish enough distance between you and the vessel. I like to keep at least 150 feet to 200 feet between vessels on either side when I'm dropping my anchor. That way, when I go back, back down to my anchor and get my scope out, we actually increase that distance. If you, at any point, if you or your other boats around you feel uncomfortable, you should pull anchor and go somewhere else. Just because, once you set that anchor, once you set the anchor arm and you go to sleep, it doesn't mean that your responsibility ends. It's
Right.
still there. You're still responsible for your anchor. So if you swing into a different boat, if you drag anchor, whatever it is, you're responsible for it, and you have to make sure that you are okay with that risk.
Yeah. And this is probably not a fair question because personalities come into play here. But let's say you're at anchor, you've set your
Mhm.
anchor, you've been there for hours, and somebody comes in later and anchors what you believe is a little bit too close to you. Is it best for you to just pull up your anchor and move, or do you kindly say to the other boat, "Hey, that's a little bit closer than I'm comfortable with"? And again, maybe not fair because the personalities involved in that are probably going to make a
Yeah.
difference. But what are your thoughts?
Well, generally, you will hear another boat approaching. You'll always perk up and go, "Oh, what's going on? Who's coming?" I always have a portable radio with me, and so if they're coming a bit too close, I'll turn it on and go, "Hey, you're a bit close for a comfort. I think if you go a little bit further this way or a little bit further this way, um, it's going to be a little bit safer for all of us." Right?
Hmm.
You can be courteous. You can convey your message without being too much. Not that I've always followed that advice, but generally you can. And then if they get to be combative about it, or then the best thing is to just leave, to move on.
Yeah.
You really don't. You can give them an opportunity to do the right thing. If they choose not to, then you should exit that situation.
Yeah. Well, and that's good advice to try and address it before they get the anchor completely set and engines are off and they're moving about their day. So that's a great point. Another courtesy question for anchors. This used to come up a lot more than it does today. And I think it's about generators. And I think the increasing use of solar is probably what's curtailing the argument over this a little bit. But there have been lots of debates in the past over whether or not it is courteous to use your generator at anchor. My personal feeling is that this is somewhat geographic based. In the Southeast, it's pretty common to run it all night long at an anchorage because it's hot if it's summertime. In the northern parts of the loop, it doesn't get quite as hot in the summer, and it's definitely viewed as more discourteous to do that. And this was something that stressed me out completely before we started the loop, because the last thing I wanted to be viewed as was discourteous. But so what's your take on running a generator when you're at anchor?
Honestly, the generators have gotten so quiet over these years. If you're 200-300 feet away from the boat closest to you, yeah, you might hear a slight little buzz, but it's not that big of a deal. And once you are actually inside of your boat, you're not going to hear anything. So I personally don't have an issue with it. And the other way that we actually went about that issue ourselves in our boat is we installed a really large lithium power bank with a large inverter. And so we run a generator for a couple of hours, charge up the batteries, and then we run the air conditioners all night long off the batteries. And then when we wake up in the morning, we turn on the generator for a couple of hours, charge them up, and we're good to go. But I honestly don't have any issue. And like you said, it's geographic. We're in the Bahamas. We've run generators at night quite a bit because it's humid, it's warm. You're not going to have a good night's sleep. So why really make it a bigger issue than it really is?
Yeah, I agree with you 100% on everything you just said. Because for years that I had seen these debates over this, like I said, I was very stressed out about the idea of running our generator at all at anchor because of that. But when you actually get out there, you realize that most of them really are quiet. We're not talking about, the Honda generator that you are running in your yard when you're doing something. They're very quiet. So yeah, and the geographic thing, and I mentioned solar, but also lithium batteries are probably the bigger game changer there, and need to use to run a generator. So before we wrap up, any other, and obviously all we can do is maybe touch a few bullet points, but any other skills that you recommend loopers try and get some practice at before they actually set off on the Great Loop?
Yes, maintenance, to be honest. I've run across a lot of people that have bought their boats. They really did not take the time to get to know their boats, and have run into issues and then not been able to safely continue their journey. And that's an important skill, because we're talking about a lot of this is safety. And when you have a lot of passages in open water, without you're nowhere close to civilization, going from Florida to Bahamas. It's 70-80 nautical miles of open ocean. Even in Florida Panhandle, when you make that crossing, there's open water. You need to be familiar with your vessel. You need to know what's going on. You need to know at least the basics. Your shaft seals, how to plug the shaft seal. There's a difference between dripless and a packed shaft seal, and how you actually service that. You should know that, because you're going to be the only one in open water that is going to be able to fix it when the boat is taken on water. I'm not saying that it's going to happen, but safety, right?
Right.
When you should know at least some basics about the electrical systems in your boat. You should know at least some basics about mechanical and how diesel engines operate, because most boats are going to be diesel in the loop. So how do they operate? What is required for them to have combustion, and kind of go into the system of this is what my boat is capable of. This is what my boat is meant and designed to do. And then they'll make you really comfortable with doing those things with your boat, and you will know the limitations of your boat and yourself. So you will not get yourself in situations where, you might be a little bit over your head. I've run personally into the issue with not knowing this particular boat and not taking the time to learn it. I made some assumptions based on the purchasing agreement that I made with a previous owner, without actually verifying it. And I've ran out of fuel because I thought I had 100 gallons more fuel on board than I really
Mm-hmm.
did. And that caused some issues, without quite a bit of embarrassment on my part. Uh, but it is those things that you really need to know and understand about the vessels, because that'll ensure that you have a safe and really good journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, couldn't agree more. Michael owned this boat, I think, for 5 or 6 years before I joined him aboard. And he knows this boat inside out and backwards. And he is very mechanically inclined. But it is a very big peace of mind for me that he knows how to fix pretty much anything that might go wrong, particularly emergency type things. And there are some loopers who have the financial resources to pay somebody to do all of that kind of maintenance. And that's totally fine. I'm not here to knock that approach.
Mm.
But I will tell you that there have been times where we have been able to continue because we could fix something. And when I say we, I mean him, but
Yeah.
because he could fix something where other boats in that same situation would have been delayed waiting for a qualified mechanic to get there. And in some areas of the country, there are not that many of them. And in some areas of the country, they are very, very backlogged and busy. So,
Yes.
there's nothing wrong with so-called checkbook maintenance if you have the means to do that. Just expect that it could cause some delays along the way while you wait for things like that to happen. So for somebody who is, has the interest to learn, come at least the basics about the maintenance, are there any resources that you would recommend they check out as they're, buying the boat and getting used to the boat before they start off on the loop?
Honestly, the best tools that I've found is owners and service manuals for the vessel and the engines
Mm-hmm.
and the equipment that they have. My boat came with a book that's about 6 inches thick of all the equipment that's in the boat from the factory, from the manufacturer of the engines. It has all the service intervals, how you perform the service. So that's number one where I would start. The second part that I would do is when buying a loop boat, especially, people generally will do a hull survey. I recommend that they do a mechanical survey from a certified mechanical repair location, and that mechanical surveyor is going to have a lot of answers for your questions. There's a couple of them that I have on speed dial. Hey, I don't know how to do this. This is what you do to get it done. So develop those relationships, because a little bit extra money in advance is going to save you money down the road.
Excellent. So, Boris, you have finished the loop now. And
Mhm.
you talked about the Bayliner you had in Puget Sound. I don't think we mentioned, maybe we did, that you bought a different boat on the East Coast rather than
Yes.
trying to get that boat here. So, I know you're in the Bahamas right now, and many of us are envious of that. But you finished the loop. You did some of the dream trips like the Bahamas and the Dry Tortugas. So, what's next for you and your family and the boat?
Well, we're going to take the boat to Florida, get it ready for a sale and list it, probably in the next couple of weeks. And then after that, we are going to go back to Seattle and try to sell our Bayliner over there as well. Because while doing this loop, we've realized that there are certain requirements for boat that we want to have long term when we buy a forever boat. And so we want to start getting to that point. And so hopefully we're going to get into something that's a little bit more comfortable for us and our family.
Yeah. Tell
But
us, what boat did you choose for the Great Loop?
we chose the Sea Ray 480 sedan
Mhm.
bridge. Great boat, awesome. We did a lot of work to make it really maintain and be able to do the loop. I mean, we've done 6,200 nautical miles, so
Mhm.
7,000 statute miles, and the boat's been performed incredibly well. Three staterooms, two heads, full kitchen, salon, flybridge. So it's
Yeah.
really good, and it ticks off all the boxes. It goes under the 19 and a half foot bridge, 4 foot draft. So it
Yeah.
goes 35 knots if you really have to.
I don't want to know how much fuel it burns at 35 knots. But yes, if you want to, you could.
Yes.
So, Boris Hodak, thank you so much for joining us today. Congratulations to you and your family on crossing your wake. And thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. Sorry for going longer than projected, but I really, truly enjoyed talking to you.
I did as well. And thank you to everyone who's watched or listened to this week. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Great Loop Radio podcast. Until then, safe cruising.